We have Karpov versus Sachs. This is in 1984 Linares tournament. Excuse me, 1983 Linares tournament -04. I'm not sure what that is. It appears to be some sort of a match between the Soviet Union and Germany. And let's jump right into it. Karpov, once again, all the games that we've seen so far have Karpov with the white pieces. And here we will see him destroying yet another Sicilian. So yeah, same as usual. We're not going to get too in-depth into the opening because a lot of this opening theory has evolved since 30 plus years ago and probably not too relevant today. This is a Sicilian Scheveningen, if that's how you say it. I'm not too familiar with the theory of this line. G4, I believe, is the Karras attack. Very, very popular back in the day. So Karpov goes for G4, H6. Right, we want to, I always forget the arrows. How is it? Yeah, G5, I guess. If they just allow that, Karpov will just go for it. So they go H6, kind of slowing down White's plan a little bit. And Rook G1, reinforcing the eventual threat of pawn to G5. So Bishop E7, Bishop E3, both sides getting along with their development. Knight C6, Queen E2, and tensions of castling queenside here for the white pieces. I mean, they've already started with G4, so probably go H4 and G5 and continue along those lines. So yeah, it makes sense to bring the king over to, where did my board go? Here we go. It makes sense to bring the king over to the other side and have opposite sides castling if black gets to castle. So bishop D7, H4, here we see the plan. Knight takes D4, bishop takes D4, E5, fixing the pawn structure in the center, right? We saw a similar theme in the last game that we saw with this square D5 being the central focus of the game. We're going to see something very, very similar in today's game. Karpov, of course, has to go back with the bishop because it's being threatened. We have the first comment of the game. It says the structure in the center has been settled, and the fight will gravitate around, you guessed it, the D5 square. Since G4 and G5 is a real threat already, black has to create dynamic play at once. So yeah, black just can't wait around here. They have to play energetically. So Sachs goes with bishop C6, immediately putting pressure on the center on this E4 pawn over here, and of course control over the D5 square. So it's a very logical continuation for black after having played E5. So Queen D3, kind of the same thing, right? First of all, the bishop needs to develop, and Queen D3 kind of eyeing the D5 square as well, plus defending E4, right? Because they were threatening to take it right away. So Queen A5, bringing the queen out, castles, and now Sachs finds an interesting solution, or if you want to call it solution, but an interesting idea with knight takes E4. This is the only practical chance to avoid being squeezed positionally, like we saw in the last game, for instance. So knight takes E4, interesting move. Knight takes E4 and D5. So the question here is kind of like, where's the knight going, right? So basically black will get that pawn back. In the game they went for an interesting move, which we will see in a little bit, but let's go over white's options here a second with the knight to see where we can put that guy. So the first one, the most logical one I guess, or the first one that comes to mind anyways, knight C3, right? Well, we took a piece And we'll just go right back. So there's d4. Bishop takes d4. And black has a strong continuation here. It's not rook d8. It's simply e takes d4. Queen takes and castles with active play for the pawn. Black has the bishop pair. Bishop f6 is probably coming. The rooks are coming to the center. And yes, white has these pawns here already advanced, but black has a lot of activity in return, and they got their own initiative here on the queen side. So why not rook d8 in this position? Interestingly enough, rook d8 runs into queen f5. And you cannot take the bishop because there's a very, very nasty pin here taking the queen. So yeah, that would instantly blunder the game away. So rook takes d4, right? Rook takes d4, and then you say, well, I could just play g6 and get this queen out of the pin, kick her out of here, and then once we do, we'll be able to take the rook, right? No, queen c8 check, game over. You are done. And then after el duro, ¿qué está pasando, brother? Puse a ver Karpov pensando en tus partidas, aquí para sacar planes, ideas y cosas. Alright, so knight c3 leads to this position, which is good for black. What's the other option here after d5? Well, the other option that's pretty logical to me as well. If knight d4, if knight c3 is leading to an active position for black, let's go knight g3, right? We'll save the knight this way. Not quite, not quite. I mean, there's d4 hitting the bishop. Bishop to d2. And then here black can just go bishop. Queen takes a2, excuse me, threatening checkmate on a1. And yeah, this isn't fun to play. Karpov just leaves the line there. Black obviously has more than enough here, right? Very good position for black to play. Instead of bishop d2, however, white can try bishop g2. And then bishop takes, rook takes, pawn takes, queen d7 check, king f8. Queen takes b7, rook e8. And this position is a mess. It says it looks less clear than what happened in the game. Yeah, this is just, it's very messy, and it's not characteristic of the type of positions that Karpov likes to play for. There is other options in this position after d5. You could try a clever little move here, queen d2, right, with the idea, well, first of all, you're hitting the queen, with the idea that if queen takes, well, you just take with the knight that's being threatened, right? Of course, there's d4, and it gets a little bit messy, but black doesn't even have to go into that. They could try queen takes a2, once again threatening checkmate on a1. So, knight c3, right, with the idea of just covering on b1 in case of queen a1 check, which is how the line continues, knight b1 and d4. And this is, again, not a comfortable position for black. So then if we don't have knight c3, and we don't have knight g3, and we don't have a bunch of other moves, what do we play in this position after d5? And here Karpov comes up with the first brilliant solution. Remember, the struggle or the fight here is for the d5 square, or for the light squares. So he plays, I guess it's a move that's, Karpov is my number one. Hey, how's it going, man? You know, I think he's my number one too. He's definitely the master who I most go to see the games, and the games that I most enjoy. D4. Okay, it's white's move. I think its move is kind of hard to see at first, but then it makes a lot of sense once you see it. Queen b3. Good move. The best reaction to black's tactical operation, white defends a2, right? We saw this was a problem with some of the lines, preventing black's queenside counterplay, and sacrifices a pawn to get good control over d5. And then, of course, Karpov and his analysis gives all the variations that we just saw now. So queen b3, you got to take the knight. What else are you going to do, right? D takes e4, otherwise you're just down a piece. And Karpov continues with his plan, bishop to c4. Updates. All right, no. Bishop c4, putting strong pressure here over the pawn on f7, right? So you think you could just castle. Problem solved. Castling is maybe not the best move because it runs into a pretty strong attack after g5, h takes, and bishop takes g5. And Karpov says that this is very, very good for white. And yeah, I mean, white's attack is already arriving with force, and black really has not really hasn't gotten things moving there on the queen side. So Sachs sees this. He doesn't like castles, and he goes for rook f8. I don't know how he could like this either. I mean, this... I don't play this line with black, but I do play Sicilian, and this is a position that I would not enjoy having. And here, Karpov continues with the smackdown. A brilliant move. First, we're going to go over some alternatives and some ideas. The first move that kind of jumps from right, bishop d5 seems pretty logical. You want to control the d5 square, so what better way than occupying it, right? But black has a very simple move here. Karpov just gives queen b4, and this is essentially equalizing for black. You're going to have to exchange the queens. After say something like bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and maybe black's pawn structure isn't the best, but they are up a pawn. Already a lot of pieces have been exchanged. Kind of a sort of endgame-ish. So yeah, Karpov is not too convinced with bishop d5. Other options include g5, right? Well, we started with the march of the pawns on the king side. Well, let's continue with the plan. After g5, Karpov gives h takes, and g6. And then bishop d5, queen b4, queen takes, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and rook g4. This is actually a good alternative for white to what Karpov played. And it's kind of hard to criticize this line, right? We'd have to go more in depth to see if any of this is actually forced. But it makes a lot of sense, and Karpov says that this is good for white. Great way to play. The pawn structure is pretty much shattered. e4 is going to fall. The pawns on the king side are fixed, and Karpov gives this as a clear advantage to white. But he comes up with a pretty elegant move here. He could have just played like this, but of course Karpov isn't going to settle for something like that. And he goes, our annotator gives this move 2 exclamation marks. Same thing, I guess it's a very hard move to make over the board unless you're very, very familiar with this theme. But after you see it, it makes sense, and since it's not our material to sacrifice, I guess it's easier to make. Rook d5, double exclam. What a move, right? What a move. What's the idea? Well, a comment says, even though this may not objectively be the strongest move, it deserves the highest praise for its principled character. White sacrifices an exchange to achieve unchallenged control over the light square. So basically he's saying, look, if I can take your light squared bishop, even though it's in exchange for a little bit more material, yes, I'm going to get a dominating control over the light squares. And of course, I think, you know, there are other factors to take into consideration in this position, specifically the king here. Sir Monarch is weak. He's stuck in the center. And we're just going to dance around the light squares. And yeah, black's not going to have an easy time defending this. So you think, well, what happens if black takes the exchange, right? And simply says, well, you know what? You got to prove it. That's exactly what happened in the game. Bishop takes d5. But let's go ahead and see other alternatives. For instance, well, the queen's being hit on a5. So what happens if I just go back? Queen c7, right? It's kind of like the only square left for the queen. Well, queen c7. Karpov says, gives this move, bishop b5. With, again, he evaluates it as a clear advantage for white. He basically just leaves it there, but we could go a little bit more in depth to see why. So a6, for instance, would be followed by bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, and here another fantastic move, actually, queen c4. Hitting e4, most importantly, you know, you can't quite take on d5 yet because Her Majesty here is pinned. So rook c8 trying to break that, and then rook d2, which is going to be followed by queen takes e4. And then you have, again, mainly these two weaknesses. This guy over here, we're not too sure what he's doing on e8. And white just has an easier game. Better structure, more space. g5 is coming, safer king. Everything pretty much just favors the white pieces in this position. Is paramount in black? Look at you bringing out the big words. Yes, it's all about the light squares. It is all about the light squares. That is correct. So yeah, Sachs is saying, you know what, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down at least taking the material. Bishop takes d5, and this is a difficult position to play, but I don't think that black is quite lost here yet. Of course, you have to take on d5. And at this point, it is clear that the minimum that white can get is to take the pawns on b7 and e4. With the pawn for the exchange and an excellent position, with his king exposed, black will most likely have no time to take on h4. And here we're going to go a little bit in depth in this position. Black opts to play for rook d8. Our commentator says, objectively speaking, this is probably the best. Now, Karpov analyzes some lines here, mainly queen b4. So what happens after queen b4? It makes sense, right? You have an extra exchange, you have more material. It makes sense to, and also your king's in the center, so it makes sense to exchange the queens and just try to get all the material off the board as possible, and you're going to end up with an extra exchange. So after bishop takes b7, queen takes, pawn takes, rook b8, hitting that bishop, right? Bishop c6, check. Rook d8, bishop takes e7. A lot of pawns are dropping here. Rook b4. And then it says that Karpov ends his line here. Evaluating the position is not entirely clear, but white can get the pawn on e4 anyway. For instance, c4, right, cutting the defense of the rook from the pawn on e4. Rook takes b3, giving up the pawn, but it's a double pawn anyway, so I don't think it matters too much. King c2, rook b4, and b3. And the commentator, Grandmaster Marin, annotates this as clearly better for white. It says after bishop takes e4, white will have a pawn for the exchange, two dominant bishops, and two dangerous to pass pawns. If, for instance, bishop takes h4, well, that just hangs the exchange, right? Bishop c5, rook b8. The other option here is to go bishop e7, which runs into rook d1 check, king c7, and yeah, this is a problem, obviously. So you can't quite go bishop e7. You go rook b8, bishop takes f8, king c7, hitting both bishops simultaneously. Bishop takes g7. You could take on e4 too. King takes c6, rook h1. Yeah, this is becoming a bit of a problem. Takes a check, takes on e5, hitting the rook, and this is clearly better for white again. Those black pieces might need to go on Tinder next time to find a connection. I don't think they're going to have time. Karpov versus Hubner. Caro-Can defense. Sacrificio de caridad por peones centrales. Fue interesante, pero hombre tenía una... Same idea. Yeah. And this, in esta partida también, we're going to see later on that maybe Sachs had some sort of better defense than what he did in the game. So after queen b4, there are some extra options here that we need to go over. Bishop c6 check, right? This is the line that we looked at. Also here, it's worth pointing out that Karpov thought that bishop takes e4 was actually simpler, followed by bishop takes h4, bishop takes a7. He thought that this might have been simpler. Our annotator, probably with the assistance of engines, thought that this variation that we just took a look at was probably better for white. So yeah, as you can see, even after going for the attempt here of exchanging the queens after queen b4, these two guys here, the bishop pair, is just so dominating. It's just so dominant. Like we said, like these guys are just so... There's just no coordination here. And the king's in the center. He's kind of ruining everything for black. So yeah, the best thing is to try and go rook d8, which is what was played in the game, and go from here. Of course, Karpov doesn't quite let up. You can go for, obviously, right, as we mentioned earlier, the minimum that white's going to get out of this is that these two guys are extremely weak. But for instance, it's more important here to maintain the pressure than to start taking pawns. So for instance, for this position, you go bishop takes b7. There's bishop c5, which is Karpov's suggestion. And it's true that white has a perpetual check here, but I don't really think that that's what he wants to go for, right? So bishop c6 check, king a7, queen b7 check, king e6, queen b3, king e7, and there we have the repetition, right? Yeah, but Karpov, if you're gonna exchange, if you're gonna sacrifice an exchange, I guess you don't really have plans of going for a draw, right? You want to go all out. Bishop c4. Good move. This is now Karpov keeps his pawn grabbing options in reserve. It is essential to maintain domination with the help of his bishops. And there's a pretty strong threat here too, which is bishop b5 check. Yeah, bishop b5 check, very, very strong threat. So that's another thing that Karpov does very, very well. He puts you in a position where you have to deal with problems. He's constantly asking you questions. He's great at maintaining the tension and maintaining the pressure, and he really forces you to make decisions. And a lot of times it's in making those decisions that his opponent's messed up, and he's able to capitalize on that. So this is a great example of not rushing to solve the tension too quickly, and just keeping all the threats and keeping all the pressure there on the board, kind of guiding his opponent to making these mistakes, right? So how do you deal with this? So Sachs is defending very well, to be honest, to this point. He plays bishop to b4, right? Obviously, if you go a6, well, bishop b6 is going to follow. So bishop b4 is kind of clearing the way for the king, giving that e7 square, right? Other options, not as good. If you go bishop c5, for instance, that just drops a piece. Bishop b5 check, right? And it interposes here between the queen and the bishop. And then the other option would be to go bishop d6, which after queen takes b7 is not a very pleasant position to play for black. Yeah, for example, rook b8, you got things like queen c6 coming along, or even bishop b5 might be sort of painful. Well, actually, no, there's queen takes b5, but yeah. This is a clear advantage for white as well. So yeah, bishop b4. And of course, that bishop is a nuisance on b4. And we want to kick it out of there as quickly as possible. So what's Karpov's solution to this? He goes c3. Of course, if we just retreat here, it's kind of transposing into the variations that we just saw, which are not good for black. So Sachs keeps on putting up a great fight, great resistance, and goes with pawn to b5. To which Karpov, of course, responds with bishop a2. We can't just exchange bishop for bishop because the whole point of this is keeping your light squared bishop and attacking over the light squares, right? And bishop d6. It says that black seems to have made some progress, but his pawn on b5 is hanging. And Karpov's next move is going to highlight an important factor here. Important detail is that this pawn now here is in the way of the queen coordinating with the rest of the board and the rest of the pieces. So this has been a common recurring theme throughout the game, is that black's coordination is not great. So Karpov's next move really highlights this problem very, very well. It's queen d5. Once again putting pressure basically on all of black's position with one move, right? We're threatening maybe bishop takes b5 check. We're threatening the pawn on e4. We're putting pressure over e5. Queen c6 check might be a thing. There's all sorts of things going on here. It says that queen d5 required a bit of calculation and evaluation. We're going to go a little bit in depth into this position again. So black goes with king e7, right? Pretty logical move. I mean, he's trying to fix the coordination of his pieces. He's trying to get everybody to play. If he could bring his pieces out and start creating threats of his own, he's going to be fine. You know, if he could consolidate and start creating his own counterplay, because he has extra material. The problem is that he really hasn't had time for that until now. A move, interestingly enough, that must be considered in this position, or at least looked at, which is actually annotated as an interesting move, is, get this, queen takes c3. Out of the blue. You imagine you're playing a game, right? You're doing everything right. You play queen d5, you're thinking I'm a genius, taking advantage of b5, and they respond with queen takes c3. What a shocker that would be. I mean, this isn't necessarily a winning move, but holy crap. King b1, right? So you say, what happens if I just take the queen? This isn't a good move. Bishop a3 check, and you have your ladies hanging here. So, yes. Your lady's hanging. That's a problem. So king b1. Queen takes b2 check. Isn't this just amazing? Same thing, right? If king takes b2, bishop a3 check. So you have to take, the rook takes, and it says, though, in this position, despite black's formal material advantage, that's an interesting way of putting it, formal material advantage. I mean, it's just is there a casual material advantage? I don't know. Despite black's material advantage, rook and 3 pawns for 2 bishops, Karpov considers this position winning. Our annotator believes that maybe clear advantage might be a little bit more precise as far as the evaluation goes. It's still better for white. But white has good winning chances. For instance, interesting move, right? Bishop d1, what's the idea? We're going to b3. or bishop c2 takes e4, right? So here are options here. Bishop b3 or this for that. Very interesting. Very interesting. So, holy moly, queen takes c3. There's another option here that Karpov considered, which was queen c7, and he planned on meeting this move with g5. And holy moly, things just got epic here. Campeonato de España División de Honor, Howell versus Naidish. Ninguno son españoles. Howell is what, British y Naidish. He's jugando con Alemania, right? He's playing with Germany. Oh, no dañes el momento, maestro. Oh. See, yeah. All right, so what line are we looking at? I got the music threw me off. All right, queen c7, g5. This is what Karpov was planning, right? Let's take a look at bishop takes b5 first before we go into that line. This makes a lot of sense. Bishop b5 is with check, so king e7, right? And king c2 is also pleasant for white. To be honest, if I had this position, God forbid, right? Me playing e4, imagine that. But if I had this position, I had actually spotted queen takes c3 as a threat, I probably would have tried to avoid queen takes c3. So to me, at least, this makes more sense. But Karpov says that there's absolutely nothing wrong with allowing this mumbo jumbo, which is strange that he would. g5, and here's the thing too, the other variation seems a lot more forcing here. Black has a lot of options that you need to consider. The first one being b4, right? So with our pawn on c3, it kind of creates a hook. It c3 is making it easier for black to attack, right? Because we're getting closer to his pawn avalanche. So b4, you have to think about that, right? So c4, you obviously don't want to open up the c file and open up lines to your king for attack there on that side. It says that this actually helps white to insert the c pawn into attack. That makes sense, right? Because with the pawn now on c4, we're kind of underlining the theme that we've been seeing the whole game, which was the light squares, specifically d5. So now the pawn on c4 is actually playing a very important part. I don't know how I feel about this, to be honest, because also, you know, this guy, now he's kind of like banging his head against this pawn on c4. We still have a lot of options this way, but I don't know. This is still good for white, obviously, because black still has his problems with coordination, and his king is in the center, and the pawn structure is just very weak, and yeah. He's got extra material, and it really doesn't matter, because this is basically, this is the extra guy that black has, and he's not doing anything. He's just spectating there on f8, looking pretty ridiculous at this point. So it's the epicness of everything going on now, right? Oh, thank goodness. I feel that this piece was more appropriate towards the end of the game, right? When Karpov finally wins. So g5, we saw b4. The other option is h takes g5, which is probably not the best for black, as this allows the bishop to exert, check this, crossfire action. I just love the way that Marin annotates game. Crossfire action. What does he mean by that? Well, bishop takes b5 check, and of course after king e7, here's a crossfire. Bishop takes g5 check. Both bishops delivering pretty dangerous checks on the 5th rank, right? So f6, what else are you going to do? And now bishop c4, threatening pretty nasty stuff, particularly checkmate on e6 is a pretty big threat. What a guy, right? And then, of course, the common idea that we've already seen in this position, well, if h takes g5 is not best, and if b4 is not best, well, what about if we try queen takes c3 again, right, with the same idea? Well, that would run into king b1, and basically we kind of have a similar position to the other line that we saw with queen takes c3, which was in this position. The only thing is that, as you can see, white has an extra tempo. The pawn is already on g5. So if this line was not a problem for white, this one is not going to be a problem for white. So basically, there we have it. The real question is, when I say these sorts of things, right? You think, what I like to ask myself a lot is, in this position, do we really think that when y está jugando en contra de Karpov? Sí, eso nunca debe ser divertido, jugar en contra de Karpov. The thing that I like to ask myself is, when Sachs plays this move, King e7, did he really see all this analysis? Or was this kind of like just sort of a maybe intuition sort of thing, right? Where he kind of feels that King e7 is the way to go. Because we've gone in depth quite a few times already into this game and the different lines and possibilities, and if they were to analyze all this, like it'd be severe time pressure, right? Is he really seeing all this and he's evaluating and he says, nope, King e7 is the best move? Or does he just go on that move by feel? It's always something that I've... ¿Qué libro recomiendo de Karpov? ¿Recomiendas? ¿Sus partidas o finales? No sé. Yo creo que si es de Karpov, deberíamos ver sus partidas completas, ¿no? Si vamos a ver, según entiendo yo, si vamos a ver finales, debería ser Capablanca y Smyslov, ¿no? Yo creo que cualquier colección de las partidas de Karpov, específicamente de los años 70 y 80, está muy bien. De hecho, estas partidas que estoy pasando yo de Karpov son una colección de sus partidas también. No estoy buscando partidas random. So King e7, and interestingly enough, this is probably the best try for black. So somehow Sachs reaches that conclusion either through just brute force analysis or just by feel, by intuition. You know, he's probably played enough games at this point where he has a pretty good feel of where his pieces belong and what the priorities are for each position, right? But yeah. So after all this, so King e7, and here Karpov plays a move that's annotated as interesting, and I think maybe our commentator here might be taking it a little bit easy on Karpov, because he admits that after this move, maybe black has some chances to save the game, although it's debatable whether white has a decisive advantage here or not. We'd have to check with the engines, but you know, I think looking at this game, looking at these games with the engine kind of defeats the purpose, because the idea is to just see ideas, right? Just see ideas and not just calculate lines, but what are the ideas behind these moves? And engines, they're getting better at it, but they really don't quite analyze that way yet. But Karpov goes with bishop c5, and there is a logic to this move. It says it's hard to give a one-sided evaluation of this move. It's surely very, very principled, and corresponds to Bronstein's idea that a firm control of the light squares should allow one to undermine or attack the dark squares as well. I'm going to be totally honest with you guys, it's the first time that I hear about this concept. Let me repeat that one more time. A firm control of the light squares should allow one to undermine or attack the dark squares. I wonder where the logic is in that, right? If you have control over one complex of squares, dos españoles más. Sarin versus Sarin es de Croacia y Páez creo que es de Alemania. Oye, pero esta gente, ¿qué pasa? Que no hay españoles en España. Oh man, that's great stuff. Spanish championship and nobody's Spaniard. That's great. I love it. I love it. Bishop c5. Okay, so what he says that, and it says concrete analysis, however, shows that black could have saved himself a few moves later. White could have continued with the consolidating move, which I think, to me, makes a lot of sense. Not that I'm questioning Karpov's moves here, but is king b1. I mean, this is a move that we see time and time and time and time again in these types of positions where white castles longs. If you want to get the king out of as far away from the center as possible, right? So you move him out of the c file, and typically in these long castling positions, a2 is going to be the weakest point in that castled position. So it makes sense to bring the king over to b1 and kind of provide some extra support to the little guy over here, right? King b1. So a possible continuation, queen c7. To me, it would make sense that the idea behind this move is we want to march the pawns, right? So maybe the queen on a5. Like we said earlier, the pawn on b5 is kind of cutting or, you know, interrupting the coordination there. So Fabi va a perder. Wow. Él como que llegó enamorado al torneo, no sé, él está mal de la mente. So here, queen c7, right? g5 and h5. What's the problem with h takes g5, for instance? Well, h takes runs into a very familiar thing that we saw earlier, which is bishop takes b5. It's not with check, but now we're threatening bishop takes g5. So you have to deal with that. And of course, if f6, remember what the move is here. Yeah, bishop c4, threatening mate. Commanding position for white. Commanding position for white. So yeah, so after king b1, queen c7, g5, black has to try going for h5 because we don't want that bishop to land on g5. And if we don't have to play f6, further weakening the white squares, then we'll avoid doing that, right? Queen takes e4, g6, queen f3. The pawn on b5 is still hanging, and the king is in danger. But this is, even though it might be a little bit more pleasant for white to play, this is far from lost for black. So this is an alternative, and probably the best one for white. Still, I mean, it requires... Está perdido. Wow. It requires this whole idea that Karpov is playing requires black to play very, very, very precise defensive play, and that's always a difficult task. It's easier to attack than what it is to defend. At least that's what they say, right? But yeah, this was a possibility, probably the way that the game should have gone. But bishop c5, interesting move, continues putting pressure on black's position. And like we said, you know, Karpov was really good at asking questions and saying, well, how are you going to play now? And just constantly putting the pressure on the opponent, kind of leading him to make mistakes or even imprecise play that he was very, very good at punishing. So bishop takes c5. If, for instance, you're trying to keep pieces on the board and you try to go with queen c7, this is not going to be pleasant because this runs into a very pretty move, a pretty simple tactical idea, right? The bishop is pinned to the king. You can't take the queen, so queen takes e5 check, king d7, bishop takes d6, queen takes, and yeah, that's a problem. Her Majesty will be exiting the game earlier than planned. So here we start highlighting the problems of having the king in the center. So simply, we'll just go with bishop takes c5, queen takes e5 check before taking the bishop, right? We want to take an extra pawn before that bishop goes down. Queen takes c5 now. And of course, black is going to try and exchange some of the heavy pieces here. Maybe try to survive an endgame. But of course, Karpov is not having it. Queen f5 check. And here is... Only here at this point is where Sachs starts to kind of go astray a little bit, and he plays king e7. Really hard to criticize this move. I mean, it seems like it makes the most sense. We'll see why that move loses. Here again, there's a lot of variations. For instance, king c6. It says that although this seems like a very risky move, after some analysis, it doesn't seem that white has a win. Who in their right mind would put their king on c6, allowing queen takes b5 with check, right? Well, let's see it. Queen takes b5 check, king d6, queen b4 check, trying to take away those diagonals, queen c5. Phenomenal move. Phenomenal move. Well, what happens if king e5, for instance? This is going to run into a lot of trouble after f4 check. If you take, this leaves the king hopelessly exposed. There's just way too many opens lines to the king on e5. He will die. And if you take king takes f4, this seems, I mean, the king venturing off to f4. This just never seems like a good idea when the queen and rook is still on the board. So rook f1 check, king e3, and what a move, c3. The king, well, actually, the queen is coming to c3. What a move. Queen g3 is the only way to defend the e3 square. So king c3 check, king takes e2, this and that and that. And the problem is, you know, usually the two rooks offer good resistance against the queen. A lot of times the two rooks are even better than the queen. But the problem here is the majority. The majority of pawns on the queen side, this guy's going to drop, and of course this guy's still weak. So if the king were safe and we didn't have this majority on the queen side, black would be doing very, very well. But it's not the case. So this endgame is very, very good for white. Probably close to winning if it's not. But of course, that's why king e5 is not good, and queen c5 is the proper defensive move. Queen takes e4 would be the correct continuation. It says it with 2 pawns for the exchange and a certain initiative. But the king would finally enjoy some relative safety. So yeah, seems like it's still very, very far from over, but si Gary no existiera, Karpov seguiría como campeón largo tiempo. Después demostró que tenía la fuerza. Por fin un español, Antón versus Chepa. Karpov está por ahí. No me acuerdo de haber visto tantos jugadores internacionales en el campeonato de España. Yeah, definitivamente. I think I agree with that. If it wasn't for Kasparov, Karpov would probably be considered the strongest player of all time. I wholeheartedly agree. And even then, I mean, Karpov just had bad luck with that match that was canceled because it went all the way into 40-something games. And Karpov had a commanding lead in that match, and had it continued, I think surely he would have won. But yes. So yeah, another good amount of lines to look at. Fun fact about this piece of music, I think the original score intended it for it to have actual cannons going off instead of the drums. And I don't think the composer was a big fan of this piece either. But yeah, let's get back to the game. Queen takes e4. But yeah, I mean, at this position, you had to try king c6. And, I mean, damn, how do you play king c6 in this position? King e7 just seems so much sense, and it gives maybe this false illusion of that the king is actually marching towards safety, right? Because if I have time to play rook fe8 and king f8, I mean g5 is still coming, but it seems that black is somewhat on his way to consolidating the position. But nope, queen takes e4 check is how the game continued. Not a lot of moves here to play, to be honest. King d7, queen f5 check, excuse me, and then king e7. This isn't quite the same position that we had before. It's too late to play king c6 because queen takes b5, king d6, queen b4, right? So far the same. Queen c5, and now rook d1 check. And here's the problem. Since the pawn is no longer on e4 like it was in the other variation, now there's bishop f3 check, and this is just and this is a point. This is why king e7 is bad, because it allows queen takes e4 with check. It wins that tempo, which in the other line, let me see if I can find it here. Here, after queen c6 and all that sort of stuff, if you go rook d1 check, king c6, just a new variation here, king c6, you don't have bishop f3 anymore because you haven't given that tempo for white to take on e4 with check. So the pawn is actually doing a pretty good defensive job here on e4, even though it's probably going to drop, but it's still the queen that's in the attack, and it doesn't allow an extra piece to come into the attack. So once all the pieces participate in the attack, it looks like it's pretty much a done deal, right? So king e7, you can't go to c6 anymore after that check, so you have to come back to e7. And here, another great move by, oh my goodness, I'm losing my voice. Another great move by Karpov. Of course, you could just take the pawn on b5. But Karpov was very particular about his moves, and he decides, there's kind of like a lot of principles in this next move, but basically if you're going to have an attack, it's best to have all your pieces participating in the attack. So even though he could have gone with bishop takes b5, rook e1, bringing the last piece into play, creating some threats along the e file, right? Some discoveries, but more importantly, he leaves his options open for the bishop. So he really hasn't quite decided yet. Maybe the bishop wants to come this way, maybe the bishop wants to come that way, maybe the bishop wants to take the pawn. But we're creating some threats, and this is kind of like what we were alluding to earlier. He maintains the pressure, he asks a lot of uncomfortable questions, and he puts you on the spot to make very uncomfortable decisions. This is Karpov thought for a long time before playing the strongest move, rook e1. It is, of course, best to maintain all the possibilities for the bishop, so taking on b5 would have been less flexible. Mr. Sachs responds with rook d6, right? I guess he's planning some ideas with covering the checks with rook e6. The only other alternative would have been rook h8 if you're going to try and retreat to the king side, which would have been followed by bishop takes b5 check with the rook, king f8, and king b1. And the same problem that you used to play like Karpov. I wish I could say that. I've always just played like myself too, which isn't great. I blunder things. Yeah, if I had to choose, I'd probably choose Karpov over myself, at least for the time being. Until I get the title, then once I get the title, I'll just play like myself. It is the same problem we were talking about earlier. This is the coordination of the pieces. There's a rook on h8, which looks even sillier than what it did on f8. So black is up in exchange, but the exchange really isn't making any sort of contribution to the position here, and white is up pawns. So rook h8, not great. To be honest, this position is already not good for black. So rook d6, and we were talking about earlier about keeping the options open for the bishop. So since we know that black wants to cover the check with rook e6, Karpov doesn't take the pawn on b5 right away with check. Instead, he goes bishop c4 check. He wants to avoid the rook coming over to e6. Of course, if we win the exchange back, this is just easily winning. You have extra material and a winning position. So rook d8. Black is fleeing with his king, or trying to anyway, to the queen side. Only now, after having avoided rook to e6, does Karpov take the pawn. So a6, bishop a4, g6, and queen f3. Right? Once again, creating some uncomfortable threats. King c8, the final mistake for black. I mean, the position is so bad, the commentator doesn't even offer an alternative. He just says, black position was already difficult, but this move just allows for an elegant finish. So I guess the idea of king c8, my guess would be that Sachs was planning on meeting queen a8 check with queen b8, right? This queen a8, queen b8, and just suffer. That's all really you could do here. But there is a very strong, let me get these arrows out of the way, there's a very strong continuation here, which Karpov, of course, spots. He doesn't let the opportunity, doesn't pass up the opportunity to play a very good tactical solution here. I'll just leave it for a couple seconds in case anybody wants to try and solve it. They already solved it. Rook e7. Tres chocolatitos para usted. A brilliant move. Brilliant move. What is the idea? Okay. So the idea is, it's a free rook, right? So if queen takes e7, then there is simply queen a8 check, king c7, queen a7 check. King has nowhere to go. King d8, and this is checkmate. Queen b8 checkmate. So yeah, not a lot of alternatives here for. I mean, after rook e7, you could resign. Sachs decided to prolong his suffering for a few more moves with rook d1 check. Interesting idea, no? Rook d1 check, so you kind of have this in mind, and you know, well, now you have the extra square on d6, but for fleeing, but this doesn't work. Queen a8 check, king c7, queen a7 check, queen d6, and there's queen to b6 check. And here, in this position, Karpov resigns. I mean, not Karpov, what am I saying? You imagine that. You imagine Karpov just gets this position and resigns? No, he does not resign. Sachs resigns because there's a forced mate. So queen b4 check, king e5, queen e3 check. You're running out of squares, and you've just run out of squares. Bishop b3 checkmate. What an amazing game by Karpov. You know, all these games that we've seen of his... What on earth is... Oh, that's the mic. All these games that we've seen of his so far, they've all finished in about 40 moves or under. Just completely annihilating his opponents. And this game, the main theme here was control of the light squares. And just controlling the light squares at all costs, even if it costs material, right? But there's just like domination and just constant pressure and not solving the tension in the center. I mean, it was just a show, really, just a clinic, what Karpov did here to poor Mr. Sachs, who wasn't a pushover by any means. So yeah, there is today's game.